Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 17th episode in the ongoing series here on Farm Chatter, Spanish Jewry Through the Ages. On this episode of the podcast, I was joined by Professor Ronnie Perelis to discuss autobiographical narratives and accounts of Marano's Conversos in the Atlantic, in the Americas. This episode actually was recorded well before the series even began, but once I had it recorded, I hadn't released it, and I realized that I was going to be doing this series. I figured that it's a good idea to include it in the series. Notably, these focus around three autobiographical accounts. Luis de Carvajal the Younger, kind of a famous individual, and if you're not familiar with him, you'll hear about him. One being Manuel Cardozo de Macedo, and one is Antonio de Montezinos. And Montezinos, otherwise known as Aaron Alevi, will come up much more in depth. There'll be two episodes, one with Professor Perelis and one with someone else on him in the next series on Farm Chatter, which is the 10 Lost Tribes in Jewish Consciousness. So stay tuned for that. But there was a episode earlier in the series about autobiographical tales and narratives with the Inquisition. This is kind of similar, but a little different. So I figured this would be a good idea to include this here, which is why it is included in the series. As always, I would like to thank the corporate sponsor of this series, Gluck Plumbing, for all your service needs, big or small, in New Jersey, with a full service division from boiler changeouts, main sewer line snakeouts, camera main lines, to a simple faucet leak. Gluck Plumbing Service Division has you covered. Give them a call, 732-523-1836, extension 1. Again, 732-523-1836, extension 1. Now, I also would like to mention, now there's finally some intro music here on the podcast. I'm curious to get listeners' feedback if they like it or don't like it. I do want to thank Usher Tesser of Control A Creatives for his help there with that, and some other things that he set up, improved audio equipment, software, and things like that. So hopefully that'll help the audio experience, as well as some graphics and things like that. Additionally, I think I mentioned this, but maybe I didn't. There's now a WhatsApp community, so one admin only, where I post Sfarim and books like what I was doing on Twitter, and there'll be a link to that in the show's notes if you would like to join that. There are two associated groups, one to discuss Sfarim and books and one to discuss the podcast. But, if you don't want to join a discussion group where anyone can post, don't join those. Just join the main one where only I'm posting, and I post about the new Sfarim books, put up the new episode of the podcast, whatever it is. So there's that as well. If anyone would like to sponsor an episode, it's $360. To do so, you can Zelle, Chase QuickBase, farmchatter@gmail.com. There's a link via PayPal in the show's notes, and you can give anything less as well to support various improvements and enhancements here on the podcast, audio-wise and otherwise. And also, been doing some research and looking into, there's a couple of new series that I'm working on and some other things. So if you want to support the podcast again in any way, you can also Chase QuickPay, Zelle, PayPal, and very much appreciate it. And thank you to those who have given. Additionally, and finally, please subscribe to the podcast, as well as wherever that is you listen, Apple, Spotify, 24/6, elsewhere. And if you listen on Apple, please, if you can, rate and review the podcast. I very much appreciate it. So enjoy this episode number 17 as we are nearing the end of the Spanish Jewry series. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Farm Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Professor Ronnie Perelis, who is the Chief Rabbi Dr. Isaac Abraham and Yelena Rachel Alkali Chair and Associate Professor of Sephardic Studies at the Bernard Revel Graduate School of Jewish Studies of Yeshiva University. And we'll be discussing his book, which is entitled Narratives from the Sephardic Atlantic, Blood and Faith, which is about autobiographies of Conversos and former Conversos in the Atlantic. So thank you, Professor Perelis, for joining me.
Pleasure, Nachi. Thank you. I'm a big fan of the podcast, so it's fun to be on. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
I'm a proud Cuban. I'm a Cuban Jew from Miami, and my family came from Eastern Europe through Cuba, and left with the rise of Fidel Castro, and they came to America. And I grew up in Miami, and in a very warm traditional Jewish home, and studied in Israel. I did my BA at Bar Ilan. I spent time in yeshiva in Israel, and then I came back to America for grad school. I went to the Department of Spanish at New York University, where I thought I was going to be doing all sorts of things, which I ended up not doing, which I think I tell my grad students always, you can go in with a clear idea, but be open to everything because things change. And I discovered the fascinating world of colonial Latin American literature, reading Columbus and Cortez and Bernal Diaz and all these chroniclers and explorers and conquerors and mystics. And it started a fascination with that time period, with that part of the world. And I always went into Spanish thinking that I was going to be doing something comparative with Jewish sources. I thought I would do medieval Spain, I would do Hebrew, Arabic, and Spanish, and kind of the interactions between the different cultures in medieval Spain. At times I was, I was and still am deeply passionate about the works of Jorge Luis Borges, the short story writer who weaves in Kabbalah and Jewish history into his literary stuff. I had all sorts of ideas of what I was going to do. I didn't really know. And this colonial stuff really got me thinking. And one thing leading to the other, I started finding certain Jewish elements in that. And that's how I got into this.
So from there, I guess you somehow eventually got up to here, which is the Marrano Conversos kind of thing, and then specifically in the Atlantic, which is the West Indies.
Yeah. So the one of the big ideas that I encountered when I was in grad school was the idea of reading the center from the margins. And whatever that might be, that you could flip out the center for the margins, but that in order to understand the canonical or the central, master narrative, you're going to understand it a lot better if you read it from the sides. If you read it from the outside, from an outsider's perspective, that's going to give you greater insight and actually allow you to critique and allow you to see the fissures and the structures of things. And so that was kind of a big idea in grad school in different forms, whether that was to do with gender, it was to do with race, it was to do with all these different areas. Reading these texts and then understanding that this time period for Jews and Jewish life was this critical time. Columbus leaves in 1492. Jews are kicked out in 1492. The monarchs signed the letter of expulsion at the same palace, the Alhambra Palace in Granada, that they signed the contract with Columbus. They're not, these things are happening at the same time. The Jews are being pressed. They're pushed out. They're forced to convert. There's a lot of things happening in Jewish life all throughout the Old World. And I was feeling, well, what's going on with Jews here? Are there Jews here? What is the Jewish story here? How are the ideas of the New World being filtered back to Europe? So I had these were like some big questions. I really didn't know what to do with them at the time. But yeah.
Okay, so now let's talk a little bit. Let's talk about the book. But before that, you do actually do this in the book before you get into these autobiographies. It's something that we probably should do here. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it. Hopefully, I have other episodes on this. But talking before we get to the Conversos and the former Conversos, and we have to kind of set the stage a little bit, starting in 1391 and then 1492, and the expulsion, the Inquisition. So talk a little bit broadly speaking and briefly before we can get up to the characters and the three characters specifically in your story their story that you tell.
Sure, thank you. So Spain, as most listeners know, was the place until 1492 was probably the largest and most sophisticated, developed, richest, culturally, elite community in the Jewish world. That is how the Sephardim saw themselves. And that is also, you could make a very easy argument, either numerically or in terms of the output. And that was true from the 9th century onwards. It was a very, very important Jewish community. large, integrated. In the summer of 1391, there is a power vacuum. There's an eruption of riots against the Jews, starting in Seville, and it spreads throughout the country, devastating the Jewish communities. Many people are killed, many people are forcibly converted, and many communities are just destroyed. Jews had to run away for their lives and were never allowed back. That was true in a place like Barcelona. It was true in many other places as well. And these riots were a shock, even though obviously there was mounting anti-Jewish sentiment and things like, and missionizing and preaching and, to Jews and things like that. But this violent turn was somewhat of an anomaly, thankfully, before that. And it was a huge shock to the community, resulting in thousands and thousands of forced converts overnight, basically, or in the course of the summer. And so now you have the birth of a converso community, right? Converts to Christianity. From the eyes of the church, it doesn't matter their status. It doesn't matter what was in their heart when they were dragged to a church and they decided to convert to save their lives. It doesn't matter if they did it willingly. We don't have records of that. We don't know. We do know it was under duress, was under a situation of tremendous violence. But in any case, the church looked at these new converts as converts, and they are now Christians, and so they have to live like Christians. What happened to the Jews who stayed Jewish? They often will be living in the same neighborhoods. Often their family members converted. So you'll have brothers, one converted, one didn't. You'll have marriages where someone was safe in the castle and the other person was lost and was thrown, into the church and decided to convert. And so now what do they do when they're married? I mean, this obviously, has huge implications throughout the peninsula. And it also leads, because the numbers were so great, it leads to kind of a general societal suspicion of the converts. Are they really good Christians? Are they secretly practicing Judaism? Can we really trust them? And also envy and jealousy, a sense of now these people don't have any of the restrictions they once had. They can do whatever they want. Look at how they're lording it over us. I mean, these things you see, and they come to a head in the midpoint of the 15th century, 1449. There's these outbreaks of another riot, this time against conversos. And there's an imposition of blood purity laws. I'm simplifying things, but just to give a sense, these blood purity laws were, again, very, very new and very, counter much of Christian ideology, Christian outlook. But they stuck. They stuck, and people were now people with converso origin, people whose parents or they themselves or their grandparents converted, had to, were not allowed into certain positions of power. This leads to these tensions throughout the 15th century between conversos and what came to be known as old Christians. So old Christians versus new Christians is another term that you'll hear a lot. And again, where are the Jews? In other words, when I say Jews, I mean the Jews who didn't convert. Where are the people who are still keeping Shabbat and still learning Torah and still keeping the communities going? They're often living right next door to the conversos, sometimes still doing business with converso relatives, and other times not. And in some communities, there's a distancing, there's an animosity. It's a very complex picture. And I mentioned 1492 because people know that as obviously Columbus sailing the ocean blue. People know about it as the year that the Jews are expelled, right? But there's something else that's going on that people often don't know, which is that 1492 is the end of a several century long battle of the Christians trying to retake territory and power from the Muslims. The Muslim armies took over the Iberian Peninsula in 711, and there's been a kind of continual war between the Christians and Muslims on Iberian soil, and it culminates with the last bastion of political power, Muslim political power in Granada, the beautiful city of Granada in the south of Spain, is finally captured on January 2nd of 1492. And like I said, it is from that palace, that for hundreds of years was the palace of the Muslim kings, where these very religious individuals, Ferdinand and Isabella, who had this sense of destiny and of religious mission, they finally completed this amazing, conquest of the Muslims, of the infidel, and then they turned to the Jews. And this, I encourage you to have people on who are experts on the Abravanel, because he has an insight here. I think I find it very compelling. He argues that it was that sense of religious debt that the monarchs had that drove them to make the decision to expel the Jews. But psychology aside, there was a sense that the Jews and the Conversos were becoming a problem. And the theory was that if we get rid of, and the theory, when I say theory, this is the logic and the justification put into the Edict of Expulsion, which was the Jews living in the same space as Conversos means that the Conversos can never fully assimilate. And if we get rid of the Jews, then the Conversos will finally fully assimilate into the Christian body politic, and we won't have these tensions, and we won't have this heresy of backsliding, and so on and so forth. So that's the reason they give for expelling the Jews. And so you have evidence before 1492 of Conversos who are caught keeping Judaism in secret, being crypto-Jews, is the term I like to use for that activity. The church calls that Judaizing. So you're a Christian, but you avoid cooking on Shabbat. You make adafina, you make cholent, right? And we have descriptions of these. You take the pot and you put the food in, and you put the coals and you put it in the ground and you cover it, and then you take it out and you eat it on Saturday. In any case, we have evidence that Conversos were holding on to some Jewish practices, holding on to some interesting hybrid beliefs, that despite the fact of their Christianity, believing that the Messiah is going to come, is going to save them, they're going to be saved by a Jewish Messiah. Renee Levine Melamed's book on heretics or daughters of Israel talks about this. And you see this carrying over to after the expulsion as well. And like I said, another thing that keeps Conversos in the Jewish orbit was the anti-Converso sentiment around them. So you might be a fully assimilated Christian and a real believing Christian, but the fact is people constantly look at you differently and don't really let you fully assimilate, don't let you join this group or that group. That sometimes leads to a certain heightened sense of communal solidarity, which in some cases dips into secret religious life. So that's, people often use the term Marano. It's not an accurate historical term. It wasn't really used back then. It means it's one of the many words Spanish language has for pig and pig products. Spanish culture really loves pig products. And so they have a lot of words for it, but it's a type of pig. But it's really more of it has a very interesting history, but it's not really historical. Often enough, a Converso who was accused of backsliding and going back to Judaism would be derogatorily called a Jew. To be called a Jew when you're a Christian was grounds for challenging someone to a duel. I mean, it was that pejorative. Also, dog was much more common. But for those, so in any case, those people who are of converso origin, who go back to Judaism or hold on to some aspect of Judaism, I in my book, and the way I look at it is I call those people crypto Jews. And the thing to keep in mind here, and this is really important because it often gets lost, is that most of these people that you could term as a crypto Jew, they're not keeping Taryag mitzvot, in secret. They're not keeping muksa. They are holding on to some things. Sometimes it's very identitarian, and sometimes it's very faith-based. So I believe that I'll be saved in the law of Moses. Okay, this expression like that. And maybe it's a lot of the practices are things like fasting. Because you can't. It's a lack of something. Also, it serves as very as a penitential thing. Praying in your heart, avoiding certain foods, avoiding them at home but not in public. So it's a range. Professor Yerushalmi in his classic From Spanish Court to Italian Ghetto, his intro there does a great job explaining some of this history and explaining what is really essential to understand, which is the Portuguese connection, which kind of will get us to some of the people in the book. But the biggest group in 1492, Jews leave, they go all over. They go all over where they can. They can't go to France. France already doesn't allow Jews. Can't go to England. Those who had the means and the money made it to Italy, which had certain city-states that would welcome them. Some went to Morocco, obviously. From Italy, many of them move further east, the Ottoman Empire. So, the great Sephardic communities of the world, were in places like Livorno, like Venice, like Istanbul, like Salonika, like Tzfat, moving there and keeping their language. This is why they spoke Judeo-Spanish, until, into the 20th century and whatnot. But the biggest group, the biggest single block were Jews who went to Portugal. And they go to Portugal. Portugal is this little country with very few resources. It's good wine, good sheep, but it has the ocean. And the Portuguese are intrepid mariners. They go out into the Atlantic. They are doing a lot already in the 15th century, early 15th century. They're setting up trading bases along the coast of Africa. And this is a complicated business. There's a lot of risk involved, a lot of moving pieces. And the Jews were seen as potential mid-level workers in that international commercial venture. So they would be the bookkeepers, and they'd be the financiers, and they would be the insurance people. They would be all those roles, and then very often also involved in the actual buying and selling and distributing. And they were seen as this important kind of learned, lettered group that could fulfill the role they played in earlier medieval times as those kind of petty and high-level financiers in a much bigger booming economy in Portugal. And so they go there in 1492. They're all over the country, actually, obviously in the main ports like Lisbon and Porto, but there are Jewish communities in a place like Bragança, which is on the border with Spain. It's in the middle of nowhere. I mean, in today's terms, but at the time was a very important Jewish center. This is all good for 5 years. And then at that point, it's a long story. Francois Sawyer, a great scholar out of Australia, has written really a great book on this. I highly recommend his work on this question of what exactly happened in 1497. But the long story short, Jews are forcibly converted en masse. So you have an entire community converted, and now you have maybe 100,000, probably maybe less, of converts who are told that the Inquisition will not investigate them for 40 years, well, 20 years, and then they bribe it up to 40 years. So Yerushalmi argues, and there's a lot to this. I don't think it's so controversial, that crypto-Judaism in any form really is maintained and enriched and spread out of Portugal. And if you trace almost any of the interesting cases of crypto-Judaism throughout the Spanish world and the Iberian world, there's going to be a Portuguese link. And all the people I deal with in this book have a Portuguese connection, even the people who are Spanish, so to speak. So that's kind of a background, to get us where we're, get us into the book and what this Sephardic Atlantic is, right? Because it's this place where Conversos and crypto Jews and open Sephardim are all involved in some aspect of this new opening of the Atlantic to trade and to colonization. And yeah.
Right. We don't want to go that's a very nice brief overview. We don't want to go further, but in Portugal, there was no Inquisition for a while till, was it 1537? I don't know if I'm maybe years wrong. And then eventually they go to, so that when there's an Inquisition there, they go to Spain, which is the Inquisition that labs, and they eventually start leaving and they go spread out like all over. And that's how we get to, so this creation of this Spanish Portuguese, the nation. I'm not going to say the word right. It's a Nação.
Nação, yeah.
Nação. So as they call them in the transatlantic trade, and they end up in the Atlantic and the West Indies and all over. Okay, so then we get kind of to your book, and this is briefly all we said is in your book in the beginning. So your book deals with specifically 3 autobiographies of these conversos or former conversos, crypto Jews, that you discuss and you analyze. So first of all, we'll leave aside the discussing them for a minute, but so why did you focus on autobiographies, and just talk a little bit about what an autobiography is and what it means exactly in these contexts?
Yeah, thank you. So I was trained in literary studies, not specifically as a historian. I've become an historian, but my orientation was from philosophy, was from literature, and I was in search of stories. I was in search of, and particularly of people's autobiographical stories. I was very much taken by this. And like I mentioned earlier, a lot of the literature that we consider kind of foundational to the colonial Latin American canon, if you want to say, are these texts that are written from the first person point of view of someone describing, I left here and I went there and I encountered these people, and then there was a hurricane, and then I came here, and along the way of telling these dry kind of accounts, took 10 miles to get there, whatever, they open up their soul, right? Because they're going, all of us, you go on a journey and things happen to you. You encounter new people, you encounter new phenomena, things happen to you. And I was interested in that. I wanted to know what happened to people. I'm curious how they use their writing to make sense of the world that they were encountering and what was going on inside of them, and the moral and ethical questions that they had, and the religious doubts that were coming up. And that's one of the things I loved about those, those early readings. And from other reading in history, it was clear to me that there were Conversos and then later Jews coming to the Americas. So what were they writing about? What was their experience? How was it different? Was it different at all? Was it, what was that experience like, coming and seeing, experiencing a hurricane for the first time, right? Something you've never seen, experiencing a tropical jungle, encountering Native Americans and their cultures and their languages and their ways of being, encountering slavery, encountering all those things that are the American experience. What was it like for Jews who were doing that? And I started digging around. I was lucky enough, I had a good summer job where they didn't pay me very much, but they also didn't care what I did. This was at JTS, at the Rare Book Room. And I thank them profusely in both my dissertation and in the book, because by not supervising me very much, I stumbled around and I found books, and I didn't understand why these books were in a Jewish collection. What was Jewish about a travel log of a Portuguese guy who goes to India? Why is that here? Why, I started noticing things, and I couldn't. So I dug deeper into these books, and I started realizing there's not a lot, but there's something here. There's something here. And I wanted to find those stories. So, in terms of autobiography, this time period is a period in the Iberian world of a real explosion of first-person narratives, of people needing to account for themselves, because it's a big empire. There's a lot of bureaucracy. You're given a mission to take 100 soldiers to this island. You come back with 20 because they all died. They were all killed, or your ship sunk. You have to tell your story, and in telling your story, you have to present yourself. So we have these kind of these kind of official reports called relaciones, which just means it means a report. It means you kind of telling over what happened, but you're doing it for a very specific purpose. But we see this very bureaucratic genre of people needing to kind of justify and explain their actions to some higher up. We see it bleeding and into, first of all, fictional autobiographies. So like pseudo autobiographies, like novels that are written in an autobiographical form. A novel like La Serie de Tormes, one of the first great picaresque novel, translated into English as well. It was a very popular book, where you have this down on his luck guy who tells the story of his life. It's a novel. It's made to be it's a novel. You're made to laugh. You're made to kind of be engaged, but it follows the format of these official tellings, these official. But that's happening in other places too, like the Inquisition. So Richard Kagan, a great scholar of early modern Spain, he wrote, together with Abigail Dwyer, a book that I use in my Inquisition course, called Brief Lives, or no, Inquisitorial Inquiries. Sorry, here it is. Inquisitorial Inquiries. And it was from him that I first got the idea, the fact that the Inquisition, when they bring you in, they first ask you to give what they call a discurso de la vida, a discourse of your life, or the telling of your life. And most people's are pretty boring. I was born here. These are my parents. They were shoemakers. I did that. I did this. That was my education. I can say the Ave Maria. I can do it right. But once in a while, people's stories are mind-blowing. People's stories. And who are these people? These aren't rich people. I mean, sometimes they are. But these aren't the people who would normally get their stories told. And that's the other thing. How do we get voices that normally aren't told? Either because of power dynamics, because of basic economics, because of levels of education, and access to the luxury of writing down your life story, of preserving it. We have this in the Jewish world, the world of tzavaot, right? It's tzava, right? An ethical will, where someone writes down what they hope their children will take from them spiritually, and who has that? Well, someone whose family cared enough and had the luxury of preserving something like that. And there are families that have tzavaot that go back generations. This is a very old, beautiful, beautiful, powerful custom. And but most people don't have that. So in the Inquisition, you'll get someone who's arrested. Obviously, they're under duress, right, when they tell their story. So the whole fact, the fact versus fiction piece is one of the, it's a classic question with inquisitorial material. But they're telling a story. And as a literary person, I'm interested in stories. So it's not to mean that I don't care about the history or the facts or whatever corroborating contextual information I can figure out. But I'm searching for people using language to explain their reality, to explain their past, explain their experiences. So I was searching for this, and like I was saying, this time period is a time period where this genre is exploding in a lot of different ways, in ways that you don't normally think about them as autobiographies as we do in modern times, but that people are presenting themselves to an audience and explaining their life. Now, you were asking about spiritual autobiography, which is what I call these, because I think that's what they are to a great extent. Spiritual autobiography obviously is going to focus on a person's religious development, on the relationship, the journey of their soul in this world, their religious challenges, religious discoveries, their growth, their falls, their the most famous of these is St. Augustine's Confessions. It's a classic and had a huge impact on future writing. But at this time period, that's another thing that's happening in the Christian world, where the Catholic Church doubles down on the sacraments of the church, and one of the main sacraments is confession, and they really push confession, and they push priests to really develop the practice. When someone comes to you, you really help them in this process of unburdening themselves and of seeing their ways, and it's very psychological. So people are doing that all the time. They're just not writing it down. Obviously, it's oral. But then we do see people like prominent Christians, like someone like Saint Teresa of Avila, writing down her life story for the edification of others. And so that's happening in the Christian world. And again, I'm saying, well, these people that I'm interested in, the Conversos and the Sfaradim, are deeply aware of all the cultural currents around them. Where are they? Where are they talking about this stuff? Where is this coming up? And so these are the questions that kind of pushed me to search for what I found, and to think about it in those terms. Yeah.
So just one more general question. I don't want to bore people with so many details before we get into the actual stories. Is it so all these autobiographies they weren't necessarily 100% true. All these facts happened, so to speak. It was more like a literary device, or not really a device, more like the authors, whoever they were trying to portray themselves and their family and their life a certain way.
Yeah, I mean the whole. Benzion Netanyahu, alav shalom, his idea was that he believed that you cannot trust anything that's written in an inquisitorial testimony, because it was all done under the threat of torture and worse. So how can you believe anything anyone's going to say there? So he refused to use any of those materials. He felt that they were completely compromised and didn't look at them at all. So, you can understand the logic there, but I think it's too logical, because life is more complicated. And you from your own life, if you remember, maybe some important event that happened to you a few years ago. I don't know, you were in a car accident, God forbid, or you remember the birth of your child or something like that. You're going to remember it differently in different times. You're going to tell the story somewhat different. Our memory, is very, it's not a static thing. The image I like is, it's not like a security camera, right? It's just taking the images. There's no, the idea of an unbiased, it's not the way the world works. That said, it's more of a question of kabdehu v'chashdehu, you can get a lot out of this material. To read it for historical accuracy, you need to be careful. And I come to all this material with a lot of suspicion, a lot of, I'm looking for the things which seem to break with kind of a pat answer, often people will give these pat answers in terms of the inquisitorial material. But all these cases, we're always shaping our narratives, and that's a much better way. In other words, someone includes or leaves out something, they're not necessarily lying. And if they are lying, well, why are they lying? So that's like, first of all, my orientation, like that. The idea of it is truth in a positivist way. Like I'm not. That's not what I'm looking for. That's not to say that these are all fantasies. These aren't. First of all, we have a lot of. I mean, the people I work on, there's a lot of corroborating evidence for most of it. So it's more of a question of, I'm interested in how they tell their story. What are they focusing on? What images are they using? What are the big ideas they're grappling with? So, yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It is maybe the question, but that's true of any time someone tells their story. It's going to be, those issues are going to come up, and they need to. They should be. I don't say, oh, it doesn't matter. Of course it matters, but you need a, and I think you need a kind of balance as you navigate those waters. Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, you touch on some of, explain some of this in the book, and then you throughout the book, I'll explain how it works, right? You go through the different chapters, taking excerpts and discussing these autobiographies in their life. So let's talk about, I guess, first overarching all three, and then we can discuss specifically. You discuss three individuals. Hopefully I don't butcher the Spanish pronunciation. Luis de Carvajal the Younger, Antonio de Montezinos, otherwise known as Aaron Alevi, and people may be familiar with his, and Manuel Cardozo de Macedo. Probably butchered all the names, but anyways, give a brief bio of them, of the three of them.
Fine. You did fine. Thank you. So, all right. So Carvajal is probably the most well-known. The name he used to talk about himself in his religious writings was Joseph Lombroso. Lombroso is a very beautiful last name. It means luminous, enlightened. It is also a not uncommon Sephardic last name. There are Lombrosos throughout the Sephardic diaspora. And the question of Sephardic last names, of people who converted and then embrace a new name is one of the interesting questions historically. Are these names that they've maintained in their family legend? Are they chosen names? All right, it's interesting. In any case, so Joseph Lombroso, he's the first one I'll talk about briefly. Is a brief bio. Moves with his family when he was a teenager from Spain to Mexico, to what was known then as New Spain, the territory which is today Mexico. He moves in 1579. He moves with his family, his uncle and namesake, Luis de Carvajal. The elder was named as governor of this large territory in the northeast of modern Mexico, where includes like Monterrey and places like that, up in the north, leading towards the border with Texas and the United States. And he was given this title to be governor, and he needed to colonize it. He brings a lot of his family members with him, and Luis kind of serves with him as his right-hand man throughout those years in Mexico. And while living as a converso, as a devout Catholic, in the inside, secretly, Luis and many of his family harbored very, very passionate Jewish connections. Maintaining practices and beliefs. And Luis takes it much further, and really, I argue, and really kind of recreates a Judaism for himself and his family. And we'll get into that. But anyways, his family's arrested first in 1589. Then they are penanced because they plead for mercy. They are arrested by the Inquisition. Yes, the Inquisition moves to the Americas. A lot of people don't know that. With the development of colonization and the empire, Spain sets up an Inquisition in Mexico City, in Lima, and in Cartagena de Indias. which is, in modern day Colombia, to port. And this was, set up to patrol heresy, just like it was in Spain. And so he was arrested by the Inquisition, penanced. Afterwards, where he works in a monastery teaching Latin to indigenous students. While in the monastery, he gets access to books, and this kind of transforms his religious life. He's eventually arrested again with his mother and sisters in 1595, and is burnt at the stake of an auto da fe in 1596, along with his mother and his older sisters. But along with his arrest, they found this remarkable book, this little book that he wrote that included an autobiography. It included all sorts of religious writings, original religious poems, meditation on the commandments, all sorts of things, a calendar. It's a fascinating work. I just actually wrote a tablet piece on this manuscript. And I'm working with two dear friends and colleagues, Jesus de Prado and Ignacio Chuecas, two friends of mine that were working on a critical edition and translation of this manuscript. That the story with the manuscript is that it was used as evidence against Carvajal during the trial. It was preserved as part of his trial record in the archive and was stolen from the archive in 1932. So how am I doing a translation? So as my book was coming out a few years back, word got out that this book was rediscovered. Someone approached Leonard Milberg, a collector of Judaica and early Americana, to buy this book. He smelled something funny. He looked into it, and when the experts assured him that this was the book, he contacted the FBI and the Mexican authorities, and eventually it made its way back to Mexico City. It's now in the vault of the Museum of Anthropology there. But before sending it back, Milberg had it digitized at Princeton. So you can go to the Princeton University website and put in Carvajal and put in manuscript, and you will find it digitized beautifully. So I have tremendous Hakarat Tov to Mr. Milberg, and so do anyone who cares about this stuff, for having it digitized and easily accessible to anyone throughout the world. Yeah.
Because before this, there was a transcript done before it was stolen, right?
Yes, thank you. So luckily, before the mysterious visitor who came to the archive in 1932 and stole it, Alfonso Toro, who wrote the first book on Carvajal, he's a Mexican historian. He wrote this first large book on the Carvajal family. He transcribed the autobiography, which was the main part, a major part of that manuscript. He transcribed it for his own use, and when it was stolen and he published his book, he published his transcription as an appendix of his book. And actually, that book, my parents received a copy of that book as a gift from clients of theirs, and I one summer, off on break from grad school, I was looking at the book, and that's where I first discovered Carvajal. So it's thanks to Toro's transcription that I first started, reading this really incredibly interesting writer. And so the autobiography was available to us, and the immense resources of the inquisitorial trial. Right, this is a trial of his entire family, testimonies, people talking about their religious lives, people confessing about this person and that person, who was their teacher and what did they do and how did they celebrate Yom Kippur and what did they do on the Fast of Esther and all these things. So we had a lot of information. And that's why someone like Martin Cohen, who wrote the next important book on Carvajal, and really it's his book called The Martyr. It's available in paperback today. Thanks to reprinting. The Martyr is an excellent resource if you want to go deep into Carvajal's biography. If you want to have fun with Carvajal's biography, I encourage you to look at the graphic novel by Ilan Stavans, very talented, prolific writer, who did a graphic novel called El Iluminado. It's in English with a lot of Spanish words. Anyways, but getting back here, so that's Carvajal. He dies in 1596, but his writings are this, place where all these different currents come together in a very original way. The second person I'll talk about is Antonio de Montezinos, a Portuguese new Christian who travels to the Americas, has an experience while there that he writes about. He doesn't write about, but he has this very powerful experience in the Americas where he describes encountering the lost tribe of Reuben, who is living in the Andes and has a message for world Jewry. He, after years of living as a converso, he decides to leave the Americas and goes to Amsterdam to share this news with the Jews of Amsterdam. So the Jews of Amsterdam, this is the 1640s, the Jews of Amsterdam are all former Portuguese Christians, right? They're conversos. They lived at least 2 or 3 generations as Catholics before coming to Amsterdam. And so this is his community. These are his people. These people understand him. He shares it with them. And then the story's kind of buried. Not much is done with it until Christians start asking Menashe ben Israel, the great Amsterdam rabbi, about the story. And Menashe sees that they're misunderstanding his message. And he feels he needs to write his own book to set the story straight. And that book is the Mikveh Israel, first written as Esperanza de Israel in Spanish and translated to many languages, where he quotes the transcription of Montezinos' deposition describing his experience in the Americas with the Reubenites. He quotes the entire thing and then writes about 125 pages or so analysis, bringing in all sorts of interesting proof texts. And it's just kind of a meditation. Mikveh Israel is kind of a meditation on the Americas, on Messianism, on the state of the Jews, on all sorts of things. It's a fascinating, complicated work and a great work that I really think needs a new translation, because the only one we have in English is the translation done in the 17th century. And the last guy that I'll talk about, my last figure is a old Christian, meaning there was no Jewish past. He did not. His parents, his grandparents, great-grandparents, all the way back are Christians. They never converted from Judaism. And his name is Manuel Cardozo de Macedo, who was born in the Azores, these islands in the North Atlantic. His father has business in England, and to kind of initiate him into the business, he sends him to England. The problem is the Cardozos are very, very religious Catholics. And England is in the middle of this Protestant, free-for-all, where you have a lot of different sects, a lot of different Protestant activity. And as Cardozo says, I started learning the Bible as I learned English. And so his whole experience of England was one that turned him on to being a Protestant. And as a good teenager, he found a great way to rebel against his parents. And he became this devout Calvinist, keeping it secret from his parents. Eventually, the word gets out. He gets thrown in prison. And while in prison, he meets an accused Judaizer, someone who was accused of practicing Judaism. And when he hears what this guy is accused of, the crimes that he's accused of, he's shocked that there's someone in the world that still keeps all the laws of the Bible. And this causes a tremendous religious challenge to him. And after a lot of soul searching, he decides that Judaism is the truth and he needs to find out more about it. And through all sorts of, different circumlocutions, he gets out of Portugal, makes his way with a group of Conversos, first to Hamburg and then to Danzig and then eventually to Amsterdam, where he fully converts. He's circumcised, and now he's known as Avraham Pellegrino or Avraham Ger. Pellegrino means wanderer or pilgrim, and he's Avraham Pellegrino, and he is a old Christian convert to Judaism, who lives out his days in Amsterdam, and at some point writes his life story down. It was preserved in the Eitz Chaim Library in Amsterdam, in manuscript. One manuscript, Benjamin Teensma wrote a wonderful critical edition of it and transcription, and a translation into Dutch. And I and Alexander van der Haven just a few months ago put out a English translation and a new kind of biographical treatment of the Vita, the life story of Avraham Ger. And I translated it to English, and I hope it lives up to the original, because it's an amazing story of religious discovery and religious development, and tells us a lot about the time period, but also on its own is a worthy text to study and to appreciate and to see in its in its wider context. So those are the three individuals and their texts, and it's hard to disassociate them from their the text that they wrote. For me, they're all interwoven into each other.
So first of all, I'll try, and I'm not going to get to be able to link to everything that you, all the books that you've referenced throughout this podcast, but I'll definitely try to link to Cohen's book about Carvajal. Well, first and foremost, link to your book. I will link to that, and I will link to in the show's notes to Cohen's book, the Stevens book that you mentioned.
Also, just I want to say Miriam Bodian's chapter on Carvajal in her Dying in the Law of Moses is a masterpiece. It's just so good. And it's just really, you learn a lot. I mean, she's a master of this stuff. And on Amsterdam, obviously, Joseph Kaplan, who, even though I was never formally his student, has been a huge mentor to me and help. To get deep into that amazing context. But there's so much more. Anyways, yes.
Yeah, no, I'm just saying, Mikveh Israel, there's a Hebrew edition on Hebrew books, like I can link to, people can Menashe Ben Israel. And then there's also, you mentioned your new translation of Macedo, so I'll try to include some things in the show's notes. Now, okay, so you mentioned all these three, and these are, you go throughout the book, like I mentioned earlier, you take various excerpts and you work through it. So give the listeners an idea, give them, an example, some examples of how you use these various autobiographical texts, how you use them in the book, and what you pull out of them to show us.
So, the subtitle of the book, which is Blood and Faith. And one of the realizations I had, and this I taught at Brandeis for 2 years, and I had a colleague there at the time, Sylvia Rome, who's a social historian. She offered to read my dissertation, and we met for lunch, and she brought it back with copious notes. A tremendous, generous soul. And she said to me, this is all about family. And I'm like, I was like, what do you mean? I didn't see that at all. I came back and I realized I know exactly what she's talking about. And these figures, the animating, one of the main animating themes throughout these texts and the larger Jewish and Converso world of the time is the way that what I call blood families and faith families interact with each other and inspire each other and shape each other. And that was my way into the text, into seeing them in connection to each other, but also as a lens outwards to the wider world. I mentioned, the importance of international trade. So there's been a lot written on this, and the question: these trading companies often function like families. And people, and in fact, people did marry in and marry out, and they kind of had these connections. And this is the sort of thing that makes the Nação a Nação, that makes the nation, this Portuguese nation, connecting them across religious lines. So, you will be doing business with someone in your extended family who may be Catholic, but you're Jewish. That's just was part of the reality. And so these texts were a great way to look at that. But also, like, so for instance, with Cardozo, with Avram Pellegrino, he doesn't have family. So who's his family? So it leads to these really, so he's obsessed with the fact that his ancestors were Jew haters. So who am I? How can I be here? How can I be part of Kal Hashem? How can I be here? How can I have a place here? And that's his anxiety that his blood is tainted, so to speak. How can I be a part of this world? And so a lot of his autobiography is proving to his reader or to himself that he deserves a place in God's house, right? That's his kind of, and he shows it through his sincerity, through his sacrifice. He sacrifices himself to protect other Jews, and things like that. In Antonio Montesinos, we get to deal with the family of man, humankind. What does it mean? What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be a Jew? But what does it mean to be part of the Jewish people? But what does it mean to be human? Because that was one of the great questions that the encounter with the New World elicited for Europeans. Are the Native Americans fully human? Do they have all the rights that we have? And this is, that was one of the great early human rights debates, or, question of humanity. And Montezinos tells his story that he begins his story. He says, I was arrested by the Inquisition and I'm in prison and I'm saying my morning prayers. And he says this weird version of the Shelo Asanis. So instead of Shelo Asani Goy, Shelo Asani Isha, right? Shelo Asani Eved, he includes those. But then he says, who didn't make me a black, who didn't make me an Indian, who didn't make me a barbarian. He adds all these other groups. This is an interesting, it's interesting nusach. And he said that every time he got to Indian, thank God he's not making me an Indian, I had to stop because I kept on having flashbacks to meeting this group of Indians in the mountains that I had this experience with. And he keeps on going back to it. And what's the experience? He had this experience on the mountain where these Indian porters, they had an exchange and they said some weird cryptic things. So in prison, saying this bracha, he has this epiphany that those people back in the mountains, those people that he is so happy he's not, those people who are, beneath him, who are powerless and abject, guess what? He says, those Indians are Jews. And this leads him on this whole journey to go back and find those Indians. And he has this encounter where, those questions, again, of the humanity, of what does it mean to be part of the human family, was it part of a spiritual family, all come out. And of course, even the way Menashe talks about him, Menashe says about Aaron Halevi or Antonio de Montesinos, he says, we can trust him because we know him. We know his family. We know where he comes from. He literally says, we know where he comes from. Many of us came from there. We know him. We can be trustworthy. So again, the sense of that idea that the Spanish Portuguese Jews had of themselves as a Nação, which is really this kind of ethnic group. And in Carvajal, we actually get siblings. In Carvajal, he has these these very, very interesting sisters that he's very close to, who are very powerful in their own right. His mother is very important. Yeah. So I was saying Carvajal actually has siblings. He talks, first of all, we have all their trial records. So we get them, we hear the confessions of his sisters, of his mother, of his uncle, of his brothers run away, except for one, the he has a brother who's a monk who's there. But we get to see the textures of their real family. But then we also see the ways that other people become brothers and sisters in a spiritual sense. And so that was the other thing that I was drawn to see these connections, and that this big socioeconomic reality of these transatlantic families has this parallel in the spiritual side. And that's kind of, that shows up in these autobiographies. Yeah.
Okay, very interesting. Obviously, there's a lot more than what we discussed about the book, where you go many more examples, and Carvajal, especially, you spend a lot of time on him. So, like I said, I will link to the book in the show's notes. People can check it out. So, I mean, this book, like you said, was your dissertation, right? It was based on that, and it came.
Yeah, it looks very, very different than the dissertation. I thought the dissertation was perfect when I finished it. I thought it couldn't be improved. And after a year or two later, I looked at it, I'm like, this is really, what is this? This is a dissertation, not a book. And that's when I saw, I kept all the same characters, all the same texts, but it went in a very, very different direction, thankfully. And that's what became the book. So yeah.
Now, this book was also published a number of years ago. So what have you, I'm assuming you've worked on something since. You mentioned you're working on some article translations. Are you working on another book, other projects? What are you working on now?
Yeah, so I have some, right. So the translation of Cardozo was something I did recently. One of my projects that I've been wanting to do, I wrote an article about this years ago, and something that I thought I was going to go to next, which is the Psalms and the role of Tehillim in vernacular in the Atlantic world. There's this fascinating translation, a poetic translation into Spanish of Tehillim, written by Daniel Lopez Laguna, who was a Portuguese converso who was arrested, and while he was in prison, starts composing this translation in Spanish, in poetic Spanish, of the Psalms. And he makes a vow that if he gets out of prison, he's going to finish it. And he gets out of prison and moves to Jamaica, where in 1721 he finishes it. It's published in England. It's a fascinating, beautiful work. And I've always wanted to, and so one of my projects that I hope to get to at some point is a study of the way of the role of the Psalms in the Sephardic context, in the Sephardic Atlantic context, the role of translation in that, and what's it doing socially, but also why translate it so many times, and how's that fitting in with the wider Protestant and Catholic context that these Jews are a part of both. So that's kind of a long way off. I said I wrote a few things about that. It got sidelined because, as I said, as my book was coming out, this manuscript comes out. And so right now, my main project is to working with, like I said, with my friends, Professor Chuecas and De Prado. We are working on this annotated critical edition translation study of the Carvajal text. And that's the big project. And because there's so much poetry in Carvajal, it's tough. The translation's not so easy, and I'm having a good time figuring that out, and it's a lot of fun. And actually, the Psalms, Tehillim, are a big part of his own world, and so I see that this is going to help me in that other project too. And so that's kind of what I'm. The big project is this translation project, and the goal would be to have a text which is accessible to a bilingual audience, because we're going to have the original in Spanish in a clear context with notes, because the Spanish is a different Spanish than today's, and a translation which is accessible and readable, but also having all the academic structure around it to allow people to go deep into the history and understand the time period and the religious sense. One of the things that we see is that Carvajal is not just kind of a curiosity about, oh, look, there's a Jew in Mexico. This is what he thought. But actually, he's a New World thinker. He's a New World religious visionary, religious thinker, philosopher, exegete, he in his own right, and kind of has to be placed in that context. So that's kind of our goal, is to make that accessible, but also show kind of the depth there. So we'll see.
Okay.
A lot of work ahead.
Sounds good. And like I said, I'll link to Martin Cohn's book on the martyr on Carvajal. People can check it out. And in your book as well, there's a lot of discussion on him, and you use a lot of the the autobiography throughout your book to talk about it. So okay. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. And we hope to cross paths again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.